Hey, my name's Kat, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a first-year doctoral student at the University of Cambridge in the Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics faculty. All students at the university also belong to a college, and mine is Newnham. I have two main specialisms, in medieval French literature and in modern pop culture. That means I look at manuscripts from the 9th to the 14th century from England and France, alongside comic books, video games, and fan fiction. What my research aims to prove is that we can learn about these separately by studying them together, and that's what we're going to get into today. The kind of comparative work between two texts, two periods, and two languages is the kind of work you might expect to do in a literature degree, but it's also a big part of most degrees in the humanities. Today's lecture will give you a sense of what an undergraduate lecture in English, modern languages, Asian and Middle Eastern studies, or classics might be like. We'll be looking at a text in Old French and a text in modern English, and all of our quotations will be in English. That makes this a really good time to stress that you don't need to know all of the languages you want to study at Cambridge. You can study some languages from scratch when you start here. If you start a language new at Cambridge, your application process and your interview for that language will be based upon your ability to engage with a text and think critically about history, literature, and culture. As part of any literature degree at Cambridge, you'll also have the opportunity to learn different versions of your language, and that's how I learned to read medieval French. So, let's get into it. Today, I want to look at two cultural juggernauts in Western literary history. The first one is a text from the 13th century. It's in an Old French, and it's called La mort le roi a tu, which translates to the death of King Arthur. It's a prose romance, and it comes at the end of the Vulgate cycle, which is a series of long texts which attempt to cover all of the main events in Arthurian mythology. Romance at this time just means any text that isn't written in Latin, and prose is the format that we're most used to today, so not poetry. As texts go, this one is very important, and we know that for two reasons. The first is that we still know who King Arthur is, and we know that this version of the story went on to inspire other versions, like Mallory, T.H. White, the BBC. The second reason is that we found more than 30 versions of the text across different manuscripts, in different libraries, in different countries, which is reasonably good going and suggests that there are many more copies that have since been destroyed by bad handling or flooding or fire, or that we've just lost. Some of you may be familiar with this already, but I'm going to speed through the story of the death of King Arthur, not least because there are so many versions. Today's version goes like this. King Arthur suspects that his wife, Guinevere, is sleeping with one of his favourite knights, Lancelot. Arthur's nephew, Gawain, who you might know better as Gawain or Gawain, has a whole bunch of sneaky younger brothers, and they make sure that Arthur catches Lancelot and Guinevere together. Because of this, Lancelot and all of his family flee Camelot. The king tries to execute Guinevere, but Lancelot rescues her, which is what you see in the miniature here, which we've zoomed in on from the last slide. Guinevere, Lancelot, and his whole family retreat to Lancelot's ancestral lands in France, and that would be the end of it, except that in order to free Guinevere, Lancelot killed Gawain's younger brothers, and Gawain is now set on revenge. Gawain persuades Arthur to sail across the channel and attack Lancelot, and they besiege each other until the church makes them break it up. Guinevere gets sent back to Camelot, while Lancelot and Gawain settle things in single combat. Gawain is killed. Meanwhile, however, Arthur's illegitimate son, Mordred, has taken over Camelot and stolen Guinevere. Arthur goes back to England and takes back Camelot with Lancelot's help, but Arthur and Mordred kill each other. Lancelot and Guinevere live, but they go to separate monasteries and they never see each other again. Now, there's so much here that I am doing an entire PhD, mostly just on this, so feel free to pause and take a moment to digest this. Today, we're going to look at how a modern text plays with this very famous narrative. The second text we're looking at today is Marvel's Civil War, which was a superhero comic book published from 2006 to 2007. It's a really interesting text to compare with a medieval romance for a whole lot of reasons, not least because since the comic book series came out, there's also been a film, Captain America Civil War, and a second comic book series, Civil War II. This kind of cultural longevity and reproduction, where a text jumps from one format to another and back, and the content changes a lot, but the ideas stay the same, is exactly the kind of development that we see across different manuscripts and different languages in medieval literature. So, let's rewind to 2006 and have a look at the original Civil War, which most people don't know as well as the film. In the Civil War comic book series of 2006 to 7, the US government passes a law requiring all the superheroes to register. For a whole host of reasons, partly ideological and partly practical, the two major powerhouses of the Marvel franchise, Captain America and Iron Man, who up until this point have been running the superhero team of the Avengers together, end up on opposite sides of the conflict. Captain America opposes registration, and Iron Man supports it. They have a series of massive fights all across New York, and those end when Captain America chooses to surrender. Captain America is then taken for trial, but he's shot on the steps of the courthouse, which leaves Iron Man to run the superhero world alone. What happens next is what really fascinates me. Marvel got one of their long-term writers, Brian Michael Bendis, to write a coda for Civil War. This coda was supposed to wrap up the story, and to be fair, Bendis had been left with a lot of explaining to do. Why, after 50 years of friendship, did the two main characters of the Marvel Universe fight each other to the death? How can we continue to be sympathetic to the survivor of this conflict? To answer some of these questions, Bendis wrote a single-issue comic called Civil War: The Confession, in which Iron Man monologues to Captain America's dead body. It's cheery stuff. And when it comes to justifying the position that he took in the war, Iron Man says this: "I came here to tell you why all of this happened. You asked, and I'm going to tell you." There's a big pause. You can visually see the break here between the speech bubbles. And then Iron Man continues, "It's because of King Arthur," which for a student of Arthurian literature is like catnip. It's so fascinating, and that's what we're going to kind of get to grips with more for the rest of this lecture. So let's zoom out. This is the full page that panel comes from. It's drawn by Alex Maleev. We can see all of these small panels, and the focus is very tightly stuck on Iron Man, which makes this as personal as possible. And then, right in the bottom corner, ahead of the page turn, "It's because of King Arthur." So, today's questions are going to be the following. Why might Bendis have decided that the best way to justify the Civil War story was by using Arthurian mythology? What is it about the way that these two texts work that allows them to be compared like this? And finally, why would Bendis only use this justification after the fact, when the story was already written? Let's turn the page. This double page spread is possibly my favourite page of anything I have ever read, ever. Visually, it is delightful. On the left, we can see Arthur's knights fighting a zombie horde, while Iron Man is fighting a supervillain in the sky. On the right, we can see Iron Man talking in the present, interspersed with a much wider image of superheroes fighting each other. What I'm especially interested in here are the visual contrasts. So we have the black gutter on the left-hand page, the white gutter on the right. The speech on the left takes on this almost poem-like quality, whereas the continuation that we see on the right is recognizably divided into comic book speech bubbles. Also, the colours are different. We have reddish pink for the past and cold blue for the present. We could remember that blue is often associated with technology and futurism. So there's a really strong visual dichotomy here, except that it's much more a mirror image of the same thing than something completely different. The reddish pink of the Arthurian sky is picked up in the explosion, the narration follows the same kind of column, and we can see the same kind of dynamism in both fighting scenes. This mirror image effect would normally be especially accentuated by the page fold, except that we're currently looking at a digital edition. One thing you might want to think about going forward is how different editions of a text can provoke different reactions. I know the text here is super tiny, so we're now going to go concentrate on what Iron Man is saying. If you like, go ahead and pause so you can have a read through the whole speech because there's a lot going on here. One thing that I personally really like about this section is that Bendis keeps pulling the same trick. So you see the whole of the page is just set up, and then he hits you with a kind of zinger right before you turn the page. So we have, "And that's when I saw it," and "I saw us fighting each other." One of my favourite things about Iron Man that I think the movies really touch upon is that he's a massive drama queen, which we're really seeing here. And you might choose to think about how different media formats lead to different characterizations and hitting different plot beats. So, to summarise, in these speeches, Bendis tells us that Iron Man is familiar with Arthurian knights, and that is what allowed him to work out that the superheroes were going to end up fighting one another, since he knows that in the death of King Arthur, Arthur's knights end up fighting one another. This is what we call an intradiegetic or Watsonian explanation, which means it makes sense within the text itself. Extra-diegetically, though, Bendis has made a choice to draw this parallel. And because we know that Confession was written after Civil War, we know that the decision was made to have a big superhero fight before Bendis was told to justify it. So, what might be the extra-diegetic reasons to run this storyline? To work that out, let's take a look at American comic book history. The superhero was introduced in 1938 by Jewish comic book creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who invented Superman. They boomed during the Second World War, which is when we first meet Captain America, and the superhero comics market then crashed after the war. The decision to reintroduce superheroes was made in the early 60s by Stan Lee, and soon became the main output of Marvel and DC Comics. Over the next 50 years, we see an increasingly sprawling universe created. Creators are trying to come up with something new and interesting every single issue, but they're also always sticking with the same formula. The tension between innovation and a winning formula is, in my view, at the heart of superhero comics. To sell a comic on the newsstand or in a newsagent, you really need the familiarity of the character so that the reader knows the character and knows that this is going to be good. But you also don't want them to feel like they're paying for the same thing every time. So you need a new adventure, something that they've never faced before. This leads to a culture of expansion. Your hero has to be the best. They also have to face something that challenges them. That means that your hero is constantly improving and that the threats they face are also always increasing. By the 90s, you get heroes that look like this. About this time, we know from contemporary accounts that comics were getting increasingly commercial and formulaic. Neil Gaiman, who you'll know as an author, a comic book writer, a TV show runner, and general kind of polymath, was heavily involved in comics at the time, and he talked a lot about what he saw as a speculation market in comics, where comic book creators were trying to sell multiple editions of one comic to the same person by convincing them that the comic was worth a lot of money rather than that the story was good. In fact, sometimes they would even use good writing as a marketing gimmick. Neil Gaiman predicted that the comic book industry would crash, and he was right. Marvel went bankrupt in 1996. If you're interested in his perspective or in this period of comic book development, I really recommend Neil Gaiman's book of collected nonfiction, which is called The View from the Cheap Seats. So back to our manuscript. We can perhaps ask ourselves if something similar might have happened in Arthurian literature. There are 3 things that might help us. Firstly, general context. The formula, as Bendis pointed out, is similar, if not the same. You have a hero, your hero is part of the community, and your hero has to face ever greater trials and tribulations. Secondly, comics and Arthurian tales are created the same way. We have Neil Gaiman here talking about the creation of comic books. He says, the economic model of making long comic series is one that is based upon the theory that the creator will need to eat while writing and drawing a page perhaps a day. So, the food and roof are provided either by a healthy advance from a publisher for longer works, or more often in a regular paycheck by publishing a story in installments. So, the normal model is to publish a comic of around 20 pages every month or so. These comics are then collected together and published in book-length collections every year or thereabouts, and thus food happens, and a roof, and in the case of successful comics, even clothing and shoes. The model Gaiman describes here sounds a lot like the patronage model which got The Death of King Arthur written. At the beginning of the text, the author of The Death of King Arthur says, after Master Walter Map had written up the Adventure of the Grail as well as it seemed to him that he could, it was his lord King Henry's opinion that what he had written wouldn't be enough if he didn't write what happened in the end to the characters he had mentioned. Therefore, Master Walter began this last part. Now, the image that you see here is from a late 13th century manuscript. It's kept in the British Library, and in the miniature, we can see King Henry telling Walter to get going on the death of King Arthur. It's worth noting that whoever wrote this probably wasn't actually Walter Map, but Walter Map was famous, so they're pretending to be him to borrow his credibility. We know that this isn't the first copy, if indeed such a thing exists, but it's reasonably contemporary to the earliest date that we think the death of King Arthur was composed. This copy belonged to the Grandisons. They were a noble family who we know were a big deal in the late 13th century. Otto Grandison served the same King Henry III mentioned in the manuscript, and he was an important figure in King Edward I's household. This manuscript also demonstrates the kind of collection that Gaiman talks about. Within this manuscript, the quest for the Grail and the death of King Arthur have been brought together for Grandison. Finally, this manuscript is also taking care to seem valuable. which we can tell from the gold leaf in this initial miniature. This is kind of like a premium edition. We can see the same technique, a bigger page, more gold, elaborate decoration, in today's premium editions of comics. Finally, the actual text of The Death of King Arthur tells us a lot about why the superheroes are fighting. We're going to be using this Livre de Poche edition for the original French, and these are my translations. So, we find out at the beginning of The Death of King Arthur that what they call the marvel, or in Old French, merveille, is getting harder and harder to find, just like we know that it was in the comic book industry in the 90s. When a dead girl shows up in a boat, Gauvin remarks, "In faith, these are marvels. I might even almost say that the adventures are beginning again." The implication here is that adventures are scarce on the ground, and that not much can surprise either the knights or the people who are listening to or reading their adventures. After this incident, the word marvel doesn't crop up for a while. When marvel does show up, it's in the form of someone remarking on how unlikely it seems that Gauvin and Lancelot are fighting. So one of Lancelot's friends says, "In faith, it's really marvellous that you should love Gauvin so much, and yet he hates you so mortally." "You can see this marvel right now," said Lancelot, "because he would never be able to hate me more than I loved him." This is very cute, but it also tells us something about the state of play in Arthurian literature. The only surprise that the creators can spring on either us or the characters is the idea that the heroes might turn against each other. After fighting for so many years of myth and legend, this is the only conflict that can surprise us and whose outcome is unexpected. We really don't know who is going to win here, whereas we know from experience that either Lancelot or Gauvin could defeat anyone else that might attack them. The final reference to Marvel in The Death of King Arthur echoes what Iron Man said about how superheroes are defined. One of Arthur's knights at the Battle of Camlan asks him to stop fighting, and Arthur replies, "You're saying marvels, since you tell me not to do what I can't help doing." Like Iron Man's superheroes, Arthur and his knights can't help but fight, and like them, they eventually run out of anyone to fight but each other. So, it seems that Brian Michael Bendis makes a comparison to Arthurian literature, not just because of the similarities of the plot at hand, but also because both texts seem to be the results of the same overarching logic, and that logic is a result of the kinds of stories being told and the way in which they're produced. It's a result not only of commercial pressures, but also of using the same characters over and over again, which is something that we can see in all kinds of literature, not just the examples I've used today. You might go away and think about TV series, or Sherlock Holmes, or even fan fiction. So, what are today's conclusions? Firstly, when we're thinking about literature, we can get almost as much information from thinking about the way a text is presented, the visual choices that have been made, and how the text is marketed, as we can from the text itself. It's only one way of reading a text, but it can be very fruitful. Secondly, when we're analysing a text, we can think both about what makes sense in universe, so the intra-diegetic reasons why the text unfolds the way it does, and also about why the creators might make those kinds of choices. These are the extra-diegetic reasons. Thirdly, not all texts are written in a single form by a single person, and that can lead to some really interesting conflicts, choices, and creative interactions. And finally, and in my view, most importantly, there's all kinds of really interesting comparative work out there that is waiting for your personal expertise to enlighten texts that we've previously understood as canon. I've been a fan of comic books since I was 14, and I'm now using them to read a really famous text and shed new light on that. What that means is that you can bring something to the table that Cambridge doesn't yet have. Thank you so much for listening today.